Sissman Loses His Way by Steve Stern. The angel Sissman, despite a taste for tailored suits and his pair of magnificent alabaster wings, was in no way an illustrious angel. Neither was he dissatisfied with his position, but was content to remain the kind of functionary angel typically assigned to births of no special note. The current on his agenda was the birth of one Ira Bluestein, destined for a predictably drab and undistinguished life. In order to reach the site of Ira's nativity, Sissman had to follow the map of his life from its terminus in heaven, the angel's starting point, backwards through a prosaic history to the moment of his birth. Made of fine, buff paper hand-milled from the pulp of glory trees by the celestial cartographers themselves, the map was soft as kid and somewhat elastic. It was indestructible in the timeless element of its manufacture, where it would endure in a heavenly archive for all eternity, but was subject to the usual ravages below. Following the map was a perfectly straightforward operation, the route clearly delineated by an orderly procession of descending years. Its major crossroads were located at standard intervals, the rare points of interest graphically illustrated, labeled and dated, highlighted in varying shades of gray and brown. The terrain was monotonously even, with no real obstacles to speak of and few unanticipated turns of events. Everything about this assignment was regular. Sissman had presided over a multitude of similar births in his time. His task was the usual one: to pinch the infant's nostrils, thereby depriving it of the wisdom it would otherwise have been born with. The wisdom in question was the ability to see without obstruction from the beginning of one's life to its end. It was a wisdom that also included the memory of paradise, a memory that would naturally make living on earth unbearable. Having traced Ira Bluestein's chronology to its source, Sissman alit on the sill of a frost-etched window above Bluestein's general merchandise. This was on North Main Street in the winter of 1927. He peered into a room where the coal-burning stove, the enamel washstand, the wardrobe, the tintypes, the busy pair about the iron bed, all glimmered from an intensity of hope and travail. Flouting physical law, a little luxury in which the angel liked to indulge, Sissman passed through the window and invisibly approached the bed. As always, his timing was impeccable, a point on which he took particular pride. He'd arrived just as the doctor, puffing in his shirt sleeves and assisted by a hawk-nosed midwife, in this case the child's own grandmother, Rebecca, was dragging Ira headfirst from his mother's belly. Then it should have been simple enough to slip imperceptibly among them and tweak the infant's nostrils. This before the doctor, wielding scissors like a predatory beak, cut the cord connecting the baby to its mother. But when Sissman reached for the puckered blue and red bundle that was Ira, framed by the wings of his mama's splayed open legs, he encountered a problem. The bubba Rebecca had grabbed hold of the angel's arm. Sissman had seen her type before, the raw cheekbones and steely eyes, rust-brown wig carelessly askew, her shirtwaist stained with blood. She was from the old country, where it wasn't uncommon to find people with second sight, though few had retained it after coming to America. This one, it seemed, had kept intact her faculty for perceiving supernatural creatures. Sissman could have kicked himself for not taking proper precautions. A hasty prayer would have sufficed. Evidently, the woman had mistaken him for Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, come to snatch the child before its time. It was a confusion that Sissman was not above being flattered by, since the angel of death was one of your more resplendent seraphim. But never ambitious himself, he merely wished the tiresome woman would let go her talon-like grasp of his arm. Resourceful under pressure, however, the angel remembered his other hand, free but for the map which he dropped forthwith. Then, ambidextrous, he completed the pinching procedure, if not quite as effectively as he might have under normal circumstances. He left perhaps a vestigial grain of wisdom that could ripen over time, though Sissman seriously doubted it. Nevertheless, chagrined by the clumsiness of what should have been a routine affair, the angel yanked his sleeve out of the woman's grip. with as much dignity as he could muster in that swimming room, while the doctor potched the squalling infant whom he held by the feet, saying, "Mazel tov, Mrs. Bluestein, you got here a fine baby boy." Sissman spread his outsized wings, but answerable now to certain laws, thanks to the error of his detection, he had to fold them up again to exit the window. He'd flown some considerable distance from North Main Street, his silhouette briefly visible against a platinum moon, when he realized he'd left the map behind. Had Ira's been a more remarkable life, Sissman might have recalled enough of its details to follow them back to their destination and his in heaven. But without the map he hadn't a clue. Besides, it wouldn't do to leave celestial artifacts lying around on Earth, where mortals might have proof of what they ought to take purely on faith. There was nothing for it but to turn around. Almost immediately he was faced with another problem. In his haste to get away, the angel had soared clear out of recorded history into a spectral dimension where time is measured in eons instead of days. As a consequence, by the time he'd changed course and penetrated the thick yellow cloud cover over North Main Street, many years had passed. Bluestein's general merchandise was long gone, along with most other remnants of the original community, the kosher butchers and fishmongers, the cobblers and used clothiers, the movie house and the storefront synagogue, the trolley lines. Everything that wasn't boarded up was tumbled down into weed-choked vacant lots. God only knew where the map was, but Sissman could expect no advice from that quarter until he'd returned to Kingdom Come, the direction to which was anyone's guess from here. Fortunately for Sissman, he had the knack, as did the least of angels, of discerning the echoes of incidents and dreams. He could track down Ira Bluestein by the ghosts of events and fantasies he'd left behind him in growing up, and where he found Ira he was sure to find the map. Despite its urgency, the enterprise didn't instantly appeal to the angel. It wasn't that Ira's experiences were so awfully disagreeable. On the contrary, his youthful exploits, swimming the river, hide-and-seeking among racks of irregular pants, deceiving the rabbi, running errands for bootleggers, gambling with roustabouts, spying on the widow Teitelbaum in her bath, the time he watched the burning Phoenix Athletic Club from the roof of his building and delivered papers by rowboat in the flood, were as sweet as any boy's. And his dreams, wherein he was often some bold composite of Natty Bumppo, Baron Munchausen, and the sorcerer Yitzhak Luria, made a colorful gloss on his adventures. It was just that the adventures hadn't lasted beyond his youth. They never did, a truth about humans which Sissman always found disturbing. They dead-ended on North Main Street, Ira's adventures, sometime during his 13th year, when a war was raging in Europe and his family had moved from the neighborhood. Neither did Ira's dreams survive the exodus. Sissman dimly recollected having passed over the war years, which had appeared as an asterisk-studded trough on the map, on his way to the Nativity. But now, moving forward in time as did the mortals, low to the ground without the benefit of navigational reference, he could feel how war had ruptured the very atmosphere. It had stunned the population, left them marooned from their pasts in a world unsafe for dreaming. Mr. Bluestein had opened a hardware store in a shopping center near the treeless subdivision where the family lived. When he finished high school, Ira, who'd shown some promise at first, then became an indifferent student, went into his father's business. The war was over, and it was said that there were great possibilities in business, though Ira, never ambitious, had merely taken the path of least resistance. Here the trail became more difficult to follow due to a tedious repetition of events which left only vague impressions in the air. Sissman couldn't help comparing them unfavorably to the indelible phantoms of Ira's boyhood, where even a walk to Catfish Bayou was a journey into uncharted fastnesses to battle rival magicians and so forth. Years that, on a map, should have required only brisk negotiation here slowed the angel down. They threatened to mire him in the wearisomeness that now seemed a betrayal of a once lively past. The angel's disappointment was so palpable it seemed to add weight to his, making the simple act of flight a hobbled chore. Still, attuned as he'd become to the rhythm of human experience, Sissman relentlessly pursued the dull hum that was certain to lead him straight to his prey. He found Ira Bluestein, a frowning, multi-chinned man in an appalling plaid sport jacket, a pastel knit shirt, a few thin hairs combed over his freckled scalp, on a crisp Sunday afternoon in October of 1981. He was seated at the bedside of his grandmother, Rebecca, in a room redolent of disinfectant and stale gardenias at the Daughters of Zion nursing home. She'd outlived practically everyone, Rebecca hanging on to her life with a tenacity that fascinated her grandson, who couldn't see why she bothered, given the chronic pain she was in. He'd visited her dutifully over the years, every Sunday in fact, since his last parent had died, attending her with the scrupulousness he demonstrated in all his affairs. But if pressed, he might have conceded an unspoken bond between them, whose nature he'd never been able to define. Now her health was rapidly failing, her sere flesh sprouting whiskers in inappropriate places, as if she were already partly a tussock of earth. But even in sleep her wrinkled face assumed a certain ferocity, her fitful snoring half a snarl. Restless, though not wanting to wake her, having exhausted his Sunday paper, Ira thought this might be as good a time as any to sort through her effects. Maybe there was something worth passing on, though he wondered to whom. He hesitated. This was possibly premature, then decided, as well now as later, her end being only a matter of time. Besides, wasn't he at bottom a little curious? From the drawer of her metal nightstand he removed a scuffed cigar box, donning bifocals to inspect the store of personal treasures inside. What he discovered was an umber wedding portrait of herself and her long-departed husband, of whom Ira remembered only a dry cough and unshaven jaw, the Zadie Abe. There was also a scrolled marriage contract with Hebrew letters like black fire, and a ticket stub for the steerage section of the steamship Bratislava. There was an embroidered napkin containing almond cookies, close to petrifaction, a silver amulet against the evil eye, a prayer book out of whose pages fell indigo petals, and an atomizer with a bulb like a swollen thumb. There was a buff-colored parchment folded lengthwise like a map. Examining it, Ira noted its curious texture, brittle about the creases but otherwise soft as kid. He opened it to find that it was indeed a weathered map, though its loci were not so much places as incidents. The incidents were depicted in deep mahogany tones where they originated in the lower left-hand corner, fading to ashen grays in their diagonal advance across the years. Following events in the order they seemed to insist on, Ira traced a boy's dream-appointed adventures to the place where they dead-ended, the Gulf, which was a war, separating North Main Street from what the illustrations characterized as a desert of subsequent years. A waste of time. Beyond the Gulf, the pictures appeared more washed out, with less attention paid to detail, their dates more difficult to discern. You could just make out the young man's ascendancy to manager of Bluestein and Sons Hardware, allowing for his father's early retirement, his marriage to Myra, a pliant but sickly high school sweetheart with whom he'd been thrown together on account of the similarity of their given names. There was a decade or two of mutual recriminations, each accusing the other of responsibility for the barren marriage, after which Myra passed quietly away. Meanwhile, through no particular fault of Ira's, who by this point in his map reading had no recourse but to acknowledge the life as his own, the business had prospered, branches opening in several corners of the city. Well-to-do, he was on the board of directors of the new synagogue, a member of the Lions Club, active in the Temple Brotherhood and the B'nai B'rith Bowling League. He was often in attendance at weddings, bar mitzvahs, and funerals, but persistently begged off attempts to fix him up on the grounds that he was a confirmed widower. He was lonely, according to the map, and frightened in his bones of growing old, though he hadn't known it till now. Watching at the open window, the angel Sissman knew it, which was what had made it more than his job was worth to push on in his search for Ira Bluestein. Having lost his own bearings in the process, the angel understood what it meant that Ira had been deprived of his at birth. And for this, Sissman couldn't help but feel sorry, unbecoming as it was in Seraphim, to sympathize with the fates of mortals in their charge. Retracing his steps via the same route that Sissman had traveled toward him, Ira also felt sorry for himself and his boring life. But his sorrow changed swiftly to anger. The life was after all only humdrum on the map, which had scarcely bothered to indicating instances that Ira clearly recalled as fraught with exquisite frustration and pain, never mind occasional joy. Who had drawn up this verkackte thing in the first place, that they should represent his mature experience as a sleepwalking lockstep toward death? All right, so he was only human, shivering in his skivvies like everyone else. But for this, was he entirely to blame? No, Ira decided, the fault was not in himself, but in his map maker. At that moment, Sissman, with his typical flair for timing, threw up the sash and entered the room to snatch the map away. What happened next never should have. What should have happened was that Ira, relieved of the map by an invisible force, would also have been bereft of the memory of having seen it. But that's not how things turned out. What happened was that Ira saw the angel. This was maybe because Sissman's uncharacteristic intimacy with the earth had left him more dustily material, or was it Ira's shock at perusing his own arid history that had done it, jarred loose the long dormant grain of vestigial wisdom that the angel had failed to expunge? The grain had fallen into some fertile furrow of Ira's brain where it was brought to instant fruition. In any case, it suddenly seemed to Ira that the promise at the beginning of one's life, rather than forgotten, ought to be realized later on. It seemed that the future might yet hold some surprises. Of course, there was always alarm at seeing your life for what it was, but the fact remained that it was your life, and no stuffed shirt of an angel in his tailored worsted, now somewhat the worse for wear, had the right to snatch it from you so rudely. Launching himself from his chair, Ira made a desperate lunge for the map, which prompted a tug of war. "In the name of all that's holy, holy," demanded Sissman, employing his mightiest reverberation. "Let go already!" But Ira patently refused to do so, hanging on for dear life. This was no easy exercise for a pudgy-fingered man in his middle years who suffered from sciatica and shortness of breath. His bifocals slipped from his nose, and he was certain he felt his hives coming on. Nevertheless, he gripped the map as doggedly as his grandmother had clung to the angel's arm so many years before. "I don't like to have to pull rank, yank, yank," barked Sissman, surprised to find that he meant it profoundly. "But you asked for it." Then he extended the awful width of his alabaster wings. Their shadow filled the narrow room in a manner that seemed ominous to the angel himself, as if an umbrella had been opened indoors. Wondering that his heart hadn't stopped, Ira managed to hold firm. "You don't scare me," he blurted in unsteady defiance, giving the map a yank that pulled the angel momentarily off balance. Summoning outrage, Sissman retaliated by beating his wings. Their cool wind whipped the curtains, scattered molting feathers, caused a wheelchair to spin in circles, and lifted both the angel and his antagonist from the linoleum floor. Airborne, Ira still struggled to hang on. "Nishtakite, shouted the hovering Sissman, all patience spent. "You want I should carry you back before your time?" Although they'd already ascended to the ceiling, Ira assured him through slipping dentures, "You're not taking me anywhere." That's when the buff paper, aged considerably among Rebecca's keepsakes and moreover stretched to twice its ordinary length, tore apart. Ira fell to the floor with an earth-shaking thud and sat clutching his portion of the map to his heaving chest. Having retained the smaller portion, whose route led from the present moment, where a demarcation of recent vintage indicated a struggle, across the featureless expanse of Ira's last years, Sissman attempted to fly through the ceiling, but still corporeal, he bumped his silver head against the cork and was forced to fold his wings for a less exalted exit through the window. No sooner had he set about following the map, however, than the angel became disoriented once more. What perplexed him was the way the lay of the land seemed to change before his eyes, the colors turning like a leaf aging backwards from gray and brown to a rich russet red. The previously flat thoroughfare of Ira Bluestein's hours, where they began the gentle grade toward their conclusion, was becoming as circuitous as a seam in a crazy quilt tossed by a gale. Incidents appeared where none had existed, bumps and declivities where before had been unbroken plain. There was mischief afoot, embarrassing behavior during business hours, liquidation sales, settled scores, withdrawn accounts, travel by night through a geography whose drama supplanted routine. There was the bubby Rebecca, who, having slept soundly through the commotion, sat up friskily in bed and called for her Jewish fish. Her grandson had kissed her parchment brow to bid her a tender so long, then returned the map for safekeeping to her treasure box before stepping off its ragged edge. He was headed who knows where, beyond the known world at any rate, into mysterious parts rumored to be the sites of lost neighborhoods, places dense with peril and romance. Here and there, as Sissman tried to make out his itinerary, the wilderness through which Ira journeyed was dotted with gardens, suggesting that the wayward schmo had recovered his memory of paradise. Nothing could be taken for granted anymore. Thanks to the angel's bungling, a mediocrity was playing hell with the meticulous craft of the cartographers of Kingdom Come. A nobody was distorting his own destiny after a fashion that constituted an unauthorized miracle. This wouldn't do. It was highly irregular, and Sissman ought to put a stop to it at once, though he was currently at a loss as to how to proceed. All he knew was that he had to act quick. If he didn't turn around and stick close to Ira Bluestein for the wild remainder of the mortal's days, a proposition which promised to be, God forbid, interesting, he might never find his way back to heaven again.